$50 trillion, an unimaginable fortune hidden beneath the frozen expanse of Greenland's ice. This staggering amount is worth more than the entire U.S. economy's annual output. Among the wealth are rare earth metals, vast gold reserves, and energy resources that power everything from our smartphones to the most advanced military jets. And here's the bombshell: the United States has lost it all. Not to Russia, not to China, but to Canada. Yes, that quiet neighbor to the north, often overshadowed on the global stage, executed what insiders at the Pentagon are calling the most audacious Arctic heist in history. And they didn't fire a single shot. While the U.S. was mired in political chaos, public feuds, and social media spats, a group of Canadian business moguls, armed only with calculators, took control of the Arctic's most coveted resources. Now, America, the so-called global superpower, finds itself frozen out of the very supply chains it needs to survive future conflicts. Fighter jet production is halted, missile systems are stalled, even NASA is scrambling for materials. The man who promised the deal of the century had no idea this was coming. This isn't just about Greenland, it's the story of how one quiet nation outsmarted the world's most powerful military without ever firing a shot. Stick with me, because what happened next shook capitals from Washington to Beijing, and it will reshape your view of global dominance. Back in 2019, when Donald Trump first caught wind of Greenland's hidden wealth, it seemed like a golden opportunity. Intelligence briefings revealed maps dotted with untapped resources and new shipping lanes opening as the ice melted. For Trump, it wasn't just a find. It was his chance to make the real estate deal of the century. What followed would mark one of the most bizarre chapters in international diplomacy. Trump didn't approach the situation delicately. Instead of quiet negotiations or diplomatic envoys, he went public, demanding the U.S. buy Greenland as if it were just another Manhattan property deal. At first, the world thought he was joking. But he wasn't. Trump even brought it up in private cabinet meetings, presenting it as his ticket to a presidential legacy. When Denmark's prime minister rejected the idea, Trump didn't step back. Instead, he canceled a state visit to Copenhagen, lashed out on Twitter, and turned a once-friendly ally into an international foe. What Trump failed to grasp was that Greenland was never for sale, not to him, nor to anyone. By turning the whole matter into a spectacle, he alienated both the Greenlandic people and Denmark's leadership. Rather than seeking a cooperative solution, Washington appeared to be trying to buy up someone else's land without consent. Meanwhile, as Trump ranted and tweeted, Canada, quietly and without fanfare, was making its move. While the U.S. focused on drama, Canadian diplomats and business leaders were discreetly building alliances, forging deals, and doing what Trump never bothered to do. They were listening to Greenland. By the time Trump returned to power in 2024, Greenland had stopped being a mere talking point. It had become an obsession, a symbol that if he pushed hard enough, he could have anything. But by this time, Canada had already made its mark. What followed next would flip the power dynamics of the Arctic, leaving America with nothing but empty threats. While Washington turned Greenland into a political circus, Canada had already crafted a master plan that would change the Arctic's future forever. Mark Carney, a man with the calm, calculated focus of a chess grandmaster, led the charge in a game few even realized was being played. While others sought the spotlight, making headlines and provoking drama, Carney moved deliberately, piece by piece, positioning Canada for a quiet yet monumental victory. The strategy was simple: build relationships, not threats. Instead of bullying Greenland with tariffs or making bold, empty promises to purchase the island, Canada's diplomats focused on one key question: what do you need? Greenland's answer was direct and pragmatic. They wanted growth, infrastructure, and autonomy, not foreign control. And Canada delivered. With precision, Canada offered 30-year mining partnerships through Greenland Resources Incorporated, promising jobs, infrastructure, and a share of the profits to Greenland's government. Abandoned projects, like the Nallinak gold mine, were revived not as foreign exploitation, but as true collaborative ventures, ensuring local involvement every step of the way. These moves were part of a methodical strategy that Washington wasn't even aware of. Denmark quietly gave its approval, European investors signed on, and before the White House even realized what was unfolding, Canada had forged an Arctic alliance worth billions, completely bypassing American companies. But the brilliance wasn't just in the contracts, it was in the timing. While America was caught up in election chaos and internal squabbles, Canada was carefully weaving a fabric of trust, something that would prove to be far more valuable than threats or military power. By 2025, Canada had achieved what America had failed to do for decades: secure Greenland's allegiance without ever setting foot on its soil. When Trump returned, demanding control, the door was already locked. It wasn't military force that won. It was patience, paperwork, and a deep understanding of the human element. It was a quiet triumph. So quiet that most didn't notice until it was already too late. Now I want to hear from you. Was Canada's approach a brilliant diplomatic maneuver or a high-risk gamble? What part of the story caught you off guard? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. And if you want to follow me as we dive deeper into the implications of this Arctic power shift, make sure to hit subscribe. This story is far from over. Beneath Greenland's icy exterior lies a treasure chest of resources worth an estimated $50 trillion, more than the entire U.S. economy generates in 1 year. We're talking about rare earth metals, critical minerals, and precious metals like molybdenum, graphite, niobium, and gold. Materials vital for everything from smartphones and electric cars to satellites and military weapons. The value of these resources is staggering, but it's not just about wealth. These materials are essential for the global economy and security. Without them, fighter jets fail, missiles can't be launched, and technology stagnates. For decades, the U.S. assumed its dominance in military and political power meant it would always control access to Greenland's resources. But while Washington remained preoccupied with its military presence, Canada quietly secured exclusive access to some of the world's most precious deposits. Through partnerships and joint ventures, Canada positioned itself as the gatekeeper to Greenland's riches. And it wasn't just about minerals. The Arctic itself was changing. As the ice melted, new shipping lanes began to open, shorter, faster routes that could revolutionize global trade. The nations that controlled these routes would control the future of international commerce. Canada saw the writing on the wall early and acted swiftly, securing critical Arctic infrastructure agreements and positioning itself as the key intermediary for the region. Meanwhile, Washington remained distracted, buried under domestic chaos and political drama, blind to the strategic shifts unfolding across the North. By the time the Pentagon caught wind of the situation, the damage was already done. Every significant mining venture was tied up in Canadian-European partnerships, and the rare earth metals essential to American industries were locked into long-term contracts with no room for negotiation. The U.S. didn't just miss the boat, it wasn't even allowed at the table. By the time the news reached Washington, the fallout was immense. Key defense contractors, from missile makers to aerospace companies, suddenly realized their supply chains were now fragile, reliant on resources they could no longer access. That was when the true panic set in. This wasn't a war fought on battlefields or in the air. It was a resource war, and the U.S. had lost its opening salvo without even realizing the battle had begun. For generations, Greenland was little more than an isolated, impoverished outpost, dependent on Danish subsidies to survive. Its 56,000 inhabitants lived with annual grants that made up nearly half of their national budget. Independence seemed like a distant, impossible dream. Then came a game-changing shift. As Canadian investments in mining, rare earth metals, and gold flowed into Greenland's economy, the once struggling nation began to thrive. For the first time, Greenland wasn't just subsisting on handouts, it was generating its own wealth. New schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects were no longer funded by Denmark's charity. They were financed by Greenland's newfound resources. This economic transformation sparked a political revolution. Greenland's leaders realized they no longer needed to play the role of a quiet dependency. With leverage at their disposal, they were ready to assert themselves. So, when Donald Trump returned to power in 2024, demanding control of Greenland for national security purposes, the response was anything but meek. Prime Minister Moot Borup Egede condemned Washington's demands as nothing more than aggressive colonialism, and he had allies. Denmark's parliament issued a landmark statement declaring that any attempt to coerce Greenland would be seen as an act of aggression against Denmark. And by extension, NATO. This declaration was seismic. In one sweeping move, Denmark effectively warned Washington that any coercion of Greenland could trigger a NATO defense response. For decades, Moscow and Beijing had dreamed of fracturing NATO's unity. Donald Trump had just unwittingly made it happen. Greenland's newfound defiance flipped the script. What was once seen as a passive territory now had the power to challenge the world's most powerful military and win. Greenland was no longer a pawn in the geopolitical game. It was a sovereign entity, empowered by European solidarity and Canadian investments. And the message to Washington was unmistakable. Greenland was not for sale, not in 2019, not in 2024, and certainly not ever. The reverberations were felt immediately within the Pentagon. The U.S. began quietly revisiting Cold War-era invasion plans, exploring nuclear submarine routes, and drafting strategies for seizing ports by force. A clear sign that Washington was no longer negotiating from a position of strength. But while America scrambled to rethink its strategy, Canada was executing its plan flawlessly. Every month, another contract was signed, another mining concession awarded, and another shipping deal secured. By early 2025, the landscape had irrevocably changed. The Arctic had been claimed, and America found itself completely shut out. Every mining license in Greenland had been signed, sealed, and delivered. Yet, not a single one had been handed to the United States. Canada, along with its European allies, had effectively locked the U.S. out of the Arctic resource race for the foreseeable future. Initially, Washington attempted to assert itself, issuing veiled threats of tariffs, sanctions, and military protection pacts that seemed like a thinly veiled attempt at coercion. But by then, it was already too late. Greenland controlled the game, and Canada had ensured that its position was protected by ironclad legal contracts that no amount of American pressure could break. Inside the U.S. defense sector, the alarm bells were deafening. Lockheed Martin halted work on its next-generation hypersonic missile after discovering that key components were unavailable. Raytheon executives scrambled to secure Canadian suppliers, only to find that these were already locked into long-term agreements with European firms. Even NASA, known for its technological prowess, faced setbacks, quietly admitting that its satellite launches might be delayed due to a shortage of rare earth elements now firmly in Canadian hands. But the humiliation didn't stop there. In one of the most ironic twists imaginable, American venture capitalists were unknowingly complicit in their country's exclusion from the Arctic's bounty. Canadian mining firms like Amaroq Minerals had used U.S.-based investment to finance their operations, effectively using American money to close off Arctic access for the U.S. government. Trump's promise of the deal of the century had turned into one of the most stunning geopolitical blunders in modern history. A nation that once attempted to buy Greenland like a simple asset now found itself without a seat at the table. For the Pentagon, this was not merely an economic blow, it was a national security crisis. Shortages in rare earth materials caused delays in weapons production, held up fighter jet upgrades, and created vulnerabilities in America's space program, all as tensions with China and Russia escalated. In war simulations, analysts quietly acknowledged a grim possibility. If a major conflict broke out tomorrow, the U.S. might not be able to replenish its high-tech weaponry fast enough to keep up. And while Washington fumed, Canada remained unshaken. Every move, every agreement, and every handshake had been meticulously calculated, and now the fruits of those efforts were on full display. Without raising a single flag or firing a shot, Canada had cemented itself as the Arctic's indispensable power, while the U.S. was left with nothing but frustration and the sobering realization that it had lost a war it never even realized was being fought. The implications of America's Arctic defeat reverberated well beyond the polar region. The shockwaves spread across the globe, rattling NATO headquarters, Moscow and Beijing. For decades, Washington had been the unchallenged guardian of the North, controlling military bases, setting security policies, and assuming that its allies would always fall in line. That dominance was shattered. NATO, the very alliance built around American leadership, now faced its toughest challenge in years. Denmark's unequivocal statement that any aggression against Greenland would be regarded as an attack on all of NATO forced European powers to choose sides. And for the first time in memory, they did not all stand with Washington. France dispatched a nuclear submarine to patrol Greenlandic waters, not in defense of the U.S., but to ensure no one bullied Copenhagen or Nuuk. Norway subtly deployed intelligence assets to protect Arctic shipping lanes, making sure Canada's new trade routes were secure. Even Poland, once a staunch U.S. ally, hesitated. Caught between U.S. military aid and European unity, Warsaw froze, afraid of being caught in the crossfire of a transatlantic standoff. Meanwhile, Russia and China publicly reveled in America's downfall. Russian media mocked the U.S., calling it an empire in retreat, while Chinese think tanks published papers celebrating the collapse of the U.S.'s Arctic strategy, using it as evidence that military might was no longer a guarantee of access to vital resources in the 21st century. Greenland's untapped wealth, once a treasure locked beneath its ice, is now a key to global power dynamics, thanks to a quiet but monumental move by Canada. As Greenland's valuable resources found new homes through Canadian and European contracts, the ripple effect on the global economy was immediate and severe. The prices for rare earth metals surged, shaking global supply chains to their core. U.S. defense contractors, desperate to keep operations running, were forced to pay premium prices to secure the necessary materials. Meanwhile, Arctic shipping companies saw a surge of investments, betting on Canada's growing influence over polar routes. But it wasn't just the economic fallout that sent shockwaves through the world. The psychological impact was just as profound. For decades, the world had believed in a simple truth. When it came to geopolitics, the United States always got what it wanted in the end. Its tanks, its aircraft carriers, and its military might were supposed to make up for any challenge. But this time, the unexpected happened. Canada and Greenland showed that soft power, trust, diplomacy, and patience could trump brute force. The global balance had shifted, and the rules of the game were no longer what they used to be. The Arctic, once a blank canvas for superpowers to divide, had evolved into a new kind of global thoroughfare, one where diplomacy and relationships mattered more than weapons. As the world looked on, it became clear the United States had underestimated the power of credibility. For years, America's size, wealth, and military superiority had been its foundation of global leadership. But when those factors were challenged, the cracks began to show. Greenland's refusal to fall in line with American expectations revealed something more profound about the state of modern power. It's not enough to be the biggest or the loudest. Trust, genuine, lasting trust, had become the most valuable currency in international relations. And when Greenland said no and Canada said yes, it was clear that influence wasn't just about what you can force, but about who believes in you. The Pentagon still holds a large airbase in Greenland, its radar scanning the skies as it always has. But that base, once a symbol of American dominance, has become a relic of an older time. What Greenland and Canada proved was that without credibility, even the mightiest military loses its edge. You can have the most advanced weapons, but if you can't access the materials to build them, or if your allies no longer trust you, your power begins to decay from the inside. This wasn't just a wake-up call for America. It was a warning to the entire global order. The Arctic has become the new battleground, not for tanks or missiles, but for influence, supply chains, and trust. And in this new era, the nation that builds the strongest partnerships, not the one that makes the loudest threats, is the one that will dominate. Greenland showed that even a tiny nation with just 56,000 people can outmaneuver the world's most powerful military, not through force, but by rejecting the old game. And Canada, with its quiet strategy, proved that rewriting global power doesn't require a single shot. The real takeaway here is that empires don't collapse simply because enemies attack. They fall when they lose the trust that once held their influence together. And when that trust is gone, no amount of threats or military force will restore it. So, what do you think? Did Canada just outsmart the US, or is America planning a comeback that no one sees coming? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want to see the next chapter in global power struggles, don't miss our deep dive on China's Belt and Road collapse. Hit that subscribe button and support the channel with one click. This is just the beginning, and you won't want to miss what's next.